I'm going to find out what caused Forrest's death.
Got something that might interest you.
Resident Evil is a survival horror series created by Capcom that first shambled into unlife in a different decade, hitting PlayStation in 1996 and Sega Saturn in 1997. The Resident Evil franchise features many entries, but to date there are only 8 main titles in the series. Due to the size of the franchise, we're only going to be looking at those main entries in the franchise. We won't be looking at any of the spin-offs, movies, comic books, or anything else in the Resident Evil canon. I'm sorry to the 3 Dead Aim fans. We may come back to them in a future video. And don't forget, if you want to see more of this sort of content, then subscribe and hit the bell harder than a French man with back problems. Our story begins way back in 1993 when Capcom wanted to make a spiritual sequel to the NES game Sweet Home. Resident Evil, also known as Biohazard in Japan, took a number of elements from Sweet Home, notably the mansion setting and the door opening loading screen. Resident Evil also took inspiration from the likes of The Shining and the works of George Romero, but notably took inspiration from another horror game, Alone in the Dark, which then took inspiration back from Resident Evil for its own reboot, The Circle of Life. Resident Evil used the cinematic camera angles pioneered in Alone in the Dark, and also allowed 2 playable characters from the start, 1 male and 1 female, these being Chris and Jill. But it was thanks to the advanced technologies of the PlayStation that allowed for a whole new type of experience. The new world of 3D graphics could bring new experiences into people's homes. Video games which in our own minds felt so cinematic now actually felt cinematic. Resident Evil felt very much like a horror movie come to life. A horror movie where you were in the thick of it, even though looking back on it, it looks kinda lame. Also, the tone of that original game feels a little off. Those FMV sequences look oh so 90s CD-ROM gaming. Also that voiceover.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
You're wounded. What kind of demon attacked you?
It was a huge snake, and also poisonous. Ugh.
Yeeks. Now, I don't like to criticize acting or directing work, but this game is so camp it has its own power hookup point and toilet block facilities. Resident Evil is all about the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, better known as STARS. The STARS Bravo team move into the Spencer Mansion after losing contact with the Alpha team. Plot-wise, that's about it for the first game. The rest of it gets revealed in cutscenes and text files located around the game world. Resident Evil sold in large numbers and was incredibly popular during its initial release in 1996. It was popular with critics too, meaning that the sequel was all but guaranteed. But a sequel would not be as straightforward as Capcom had hoped. Resident Evil 2 was earmarked for a 1997 release, roughly a year after the first game. And while that may seem like a short turnaround time, back in them days, games did not take long to produce. Capcom were experimenting with zombies with a lower polygon count, which would allow for more dead heads on screen at once, as well as a more realistic aesthetic for the Raccoon City police station. Unhappy with how development was progressing, Hideki Kamiya and co threw a lot of their work out and decided to entirely restart development on Resident Evil 2. Instead, Capcom would release Resident Evil Director's Cut in 1997 in lieu of a new game. A quick note, the cancelled content from Resident Evil 2 was leaked to the internet many years later and is now partially playable and is known to fans as Resident Evil 1.5. The director's cut of the first game featured a beginner mode which made the game easier, as well as tweaking the item and enemy placement. But most enticing was the addition of the totally uncensored FMV footage from the Japanese version of the game, which was previously cut from the original release. Sadly, due to issues far too boring to go into, Capcom accidentally cut out this uncensored footage. Good work, lads. Resident Evil 2 would finally land in 1998 and it was all we could dream of and more. It took everything the original game did and improved it and expanded upon it. Raccoon City felt like a sprawling location, and while it only really comprised of a handful of scenes, it helped Resident Evil feel like it was set in a big city location. Gone was the super campy tone of the original game, replaced with a more serious tone, and in retrospect, still quite campy tone. Jill and Chris are now gone and replaced with Leon and his wonderful curtains. and Chris's sister Claire. Gameplay remained relatively unchanged from the first game, with different locations being unlocked over the course of the playthrough. The plot was once again revealed through cutscenes and text files. Resident Evil felt like a step up in every way and is much loved by fans. It also introduced new lore and beloved characters such as Ada Wong, Mr. X, and the Birkins. Resident Evil 2 was a hit with gamers and critics, its success dwarfing that of the original game. On a personal note, despite this game being 25 years old, it's still great fun to play today. Resident Evil 2 was followed up by Resident Evil 3, because that's how numbers work. It would come out only 1 year later, a lesson Capcom would definitely learn from. The so-called real Resident Evil 3 was apparently due to feature the character Hunk on a cruise liner. However, this idea was shelved due to the announcement of the PlayStation 2. This new Resident Evil 3 would take too long to be released for PS1, and the project would take too long to convert into a PS2 project, so it was canned. On the subject of Capcom converting games for PS2, Onimusha was originally meant to be released for the PS1, until development shifted to the next generation. We recently covered this in a cancelled PS1 games video. Maybe go and check that out. I'm sure you'll like it. Perhaps knowing it would take some time to develop a new style Resident Evil game for next-gen consoles, Capcom performed a switcheroo and elevated Nemesis to a full-on numbered release, with returning Jill Valentine in the lead, drawing on the concept of a repeating villain pursuing you, as they did with Mr. X in Resi 2. They introduced Nemesis, a huge hulking monster that would jump you unexpectedly, leading you to either flee or try and take him on. The game once again took place in Raccoon City, with much of the game taking part in the city's streets. Mostly new locations were used, but we did visit a couple of locations last seen in Resident Evil 2, although in this game the background had seen a lot more detail. Resident Evil 3 received great reviews from critics, though some did bemoan the single-player campaign instead of 2 characters in the previous games. Just as we'd seen the T-Virus mutate during these early Resident Evil games, so too would the series have to mutate and evolve to stay relevant. But how could Capcom achieve this? There would not be another mainline Resident Evil game for quite some time. But Capcom were no fools and would release a series of spin-offs to keep the franchise fresh. While we aren't talking in depth about these spin-offs in this video, we would be remiss to not give Resident Evil Code Veronica a shout, if only for the reason I feel that Resi fans would kick off if we didn't. Originally released for the beautiful Dreamcast, R.I.P. my boy, the game featured a similar look to the first 3 games in the series, and saw Claire Redfield return as she looked for her brother Chris on a mysterious island. It was also hard as balls. 2002 would bring some heavy hitters with the remake of Resident Evil for the brand spanking new GameCube, which gave the survival horror icon a whole new look, featuring beautiful graphics, better movement, and a script written a bit less by aliens, although it was still quite camp.
Wesker.
Jill, so you're safe.
That's what I was going to say.
I apologize. It was all I could do to protect myself against those strange creatures.
I understand. Anyway, it's good that you're safe.
Did you notice? Barry, he sounded a little flaky.
Now that you mention it, yeah.
Resi fans often cite this as not only the best game in the series, but one of the best horror games, full stop. Also in 2002, we saw the prequel Resident Evil 0. Players would take on the role of either Billy or Rebecca. Resi fans are a lot less keen on this one, not just because of Billy's tribal tattoo either. Ugh, that's so 2000s, darling. Various spin-offs and prequels were all in development while Capcom was busy at work on Resident Evil 4. Development had been going since 1999, and Capcom initially wanted to make the game cooler. And as we all know, kids, Resident Evil is not cool, which in turn actually brings it all the way back round to actually being cool again. This cool cancelled Resident Evil game would eventually become Devil May Cry. The development restarted in the early 2000s, and there were several betas that Capcom actually showed off. The most popular video saw Leon Kennedy making his way around a European-style castle as he fought against what appeared to be fog-like ghosts, sentient dolls, and an enemy called Hookman. This new direction for the series felt unusual and definitely different, but not in a bad way. The graphics in this beta felt more akin to the Resident Evil remake style, and the game still employed an element of that cinematic camera angle. The game was now 3D, so the pre-rendered backgrounds were gone, and the camera could move freely through the scenes. There were other versions of Resident Evil 4 that the game could have developed into, but eventually it would settle on the third-person over-the-shoulder camera angle we all know and love. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 would arrive exclusive to GameCube. Yeah, I bet you forgot that, didn't you? Nintendo had been looking for ways to make the Cube seem cooler, and Resident Evil proved that the GameCube wasn't just for kids after all. A PlayStation 2 port landed almost 1 year later, despite Shinji Mikami's rather wild assurances, and was followed by about 9 million other ports in the years since. Resident Evil 4 sees the return of Leon Kennedy, who is now, for some reason, a US government agent. I'm sure it's covered in the plot somewhere, I'm sure of it. And he's looking to rescue the president's daughter. This man must have had a hell of a career after Raccoon City. Along the way, Leon uncovers the usual Resident Evil tropes, viruses, plans for global domination, and so on and so forth. The action in Resident Evil 4 was intense, and this was a new experience for Resident Evil fans. Zombies were replaced with infected villagers, which spiced up the gameplay a lot. Villagers could wield weapons and had remarkable AI, which still stands up well today. Hide on a roof and they'll put up ladders to get you. They'll smash down doors and windows and shout Spanish in your face. It's kind of like a holiday in Benidorm. Resident Evil felt fresh and dynamic once again, and most importantly was a huge success with great review scores and awards galore. The game sold pretty well too, and naturally Resident Evil 4 would lead on to Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 would arrive in 2009 and follow the formula that made Resident Evil 4 such a success. A wise move, with the best sequels always building on what came before. From a gameplay point of view, Resident Evil 5 was more of the same, this time taking place in West Africa. Enemies could now wield guns and grenades, and there was a higher focus on action too. Notably, the game introduced split-screen co-op for the first time in the series, a welcome addition that fit the game nicely, not just because Shiva's AI is not to be trusted. In Resident Evil 5, we join a decidedly more fridge-like Chris Redfield, now a member of the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. Over the course of the game, Chris uncovers a plan to do something with a virus and blah blah blah, take over the world. You've heard this before, it's Resident Evil. But we do see a welcome return from Albert Wesker. How you doing, Al? Also, they have a fight in the volcano and Chris punches a boulder, and that's all you need to know about Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 changed the series significantly. While the fourth entry was notable for its shift in creeping horror to horror action, the fifth entry really doubled down on that action. Video game markets had shifted, and out-and-out action games were now the norm for AAA experiences. Horror games, however, had become a little more niche. Did Capcom want Resi 5 to become more mainstream to keep their golden goose in the AAA market? The only thing to be sure is that Resident Evil 5 was the first game in the main series not to get overwhelmingly positive reviews. Metacritic scores the Xbox 360 version in the mid-80s. Very good indeed, but a far cry from the 90 plus the series was used to. Reviewers would claim that the camera and controls were already outdated, and they were right. Especially in the wake of games like Gears of War, as well as Resident Evil 5 doing away almost entirely with puzzles, a staple of the series. While Resident Evil 5 was a gigantic commercial success, Capcom had it all to prove with Resident Evil 6, but would they succeed? The answer is no. 2012's Resident Evil 6 proved to be a disaster, possibly worse than the one that affected Raccoon City. Capcom really felt like they wanted to have their cake and eat it. They wanted to create a game that catered to the mainstream crowd but also kept their core fan base happy. They would succeed at doing neither of these things. Resident Evil 6 has a number of intertwining plot narratives. We've got Leon Kennedy investigating a bioterror attack. Chris Redfield has amnesia, but he is still working with the BSAA. It's good to stay employed, Chris. Ada Wong is there as well, kind of doing her own thing as normal. And we have a newcomer, Jake Muller, a mercenary who has an immunity to the virus. Each campaign is meant to have a different feel to it. Leon's campaign is a more traditional survival horror experience. It even has zombies in it. Chris's campaign has a focus on action much like Resident Evil 5, as does Jake's campaign, but that does have a slightly different feel to it, as it has hand-to-hand combat incorporated into it. Ada's campaign, however, focuses on stealth and puzzle solving. Resident Evil 6 was definitely a jack of all trades, but a master of none, not even unlocking. Resident Evil 6 proved a mixed bag, and this was reflected in review scores. Its scores averaged best on PS3, but that still only managed 74 out of 100. Let me reiterate, that was the best. It's not a bad score, but it's not top tier that you'd expect from Resident Evil. Some hated the game, with Destructoid giving the game a lowly 3 out of 10. Resident Evil 6 had pleased no one. Resident Evil fans hated it, and it has failed to attract the Call of Duty and Need for Speed kids quaffing cans of Monster like they aren't heart attacks in a can. Capcom were forced to take a deep look in the metaphorical mirror, but where do they go from here? Resident Evil held pride of place as Capcom's MVP franchise, but it was clear that its crown was slipping. Resident Evil 5 had felt to many as being out of touch and not what the franchise was about at all. And Resident Evil 6 tried to be everything to everyone but ended up being nothing to no one. What exactly was Resident Evil? Capcom had to stop and face the identity crisis. Resident Evil needs to be refocused, but how? Capcom wisely decided to pursue the survival horror angle as opposed to the action horror that had been previous installments. Capcom put together a demo featuring no action and only puzzles for Resident Evil 7, and while it bore many similarities to another horror demo, PT, it actually wasn't. You'd be forgiven in thinking that Capcom had taken Kojima's PT idea and ran with it, especially with the cancellation of Silent Hills, but a first-person version of Resident Evil was in the mix as early as 2014. Capcom had a brand new engine at play, the RE engine, which stands for Resident Evil Wait, what? It doesn't stand for that. Oh, turns out it stands for Reach for the Moon. Okay, great. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard would totally reinvent the series with the game shifting to a first-person perspective, featuring fewer but still challenging combat encounters as well as boss fights. A major focus would be on the themes and atmosphere of the game, feeling more Texas Chainsaw Massacre than Resident Evil. But this wasn't a bad thing. Resident Evil now felt fresh and different, and it helped that this game was largely disconnected from the now bloated Resi canon. Resident Evil 7 felt a much more intimate experience than the bombastic themes of previous entries. A world away from Umbrella and their viruses and world domination plans, Resident Evil 7 follows Ethan Winters as he searches for his missing wife Mia. His journey takes him to a mysterious remote plantation complex in Louisiana, and it isn't long before he comes into contact with the sinister Baker family. This game was well received by critics, yet it holds a relatively low critical average of 86 across Xbox One and PS4. Despite this, it has received some stellar reviews from major outlets, with Destructoid, PC Gamer and Electronic Gaming Monthly giving it almost perfect reviews. Resident Evil 7 was nominated for many awards and won several, including the Famitsu Award for Excellence. It was also declared as the greatest horror game of all time by Games Radar, a bold claim considering they've listed Layers of Fear as the second greatest horror game of all time. Maybe this list should be taken with a handful of salt. No disrespect, Layers of Fear, you're still a spooky boy. Fans loved Resident Evil 7, especially after the lukewarm reception of Resi 6, with many proclaiming the game to be a return to form for the series. Resident Evil 7 initially sold 3.5 million copies and has continued to sell in the years since release and currently sits on 13 million copies sold. It would surprise no one when Resident Evil 8 rolled into production. But before we'd get there, Capcom would release 2 remakes for classic Resident Evil games. These remakes would be Resident Evil 2 and 3 in 2019 and 2020 respectively, and they both were a bit good. Resident Evil 2 was given extremely positive reviews, and everyone seemed to love this revamped over-the-shoulder camera, as well as the excellent Mr. X, a hulking stalking enemy that pursues the player around the Raccoon City police station. The Resident Evil 3 remake was less successful, but not as bad as some might suggest. The game was a little short and lacked replay value, but it was still a solid release, just simply not as good as its predecessor, and it really felt like it was rushed out the door. Hey, wait a minute. We finally got our hands on a whole new Resident Evil game in 2021 with Resident Evil Village. While Resident Evil Village takes the first-person gameplay of Resident Evil 7, it has a very different tone. The intimate story of a family corrupted by evil is replaced by werewolves and everyone's new mommy. Yeah, you know who we're talking about. Resident Evil Village continues the story of Ethan Winters as he seeks to rescue his daughter Rose, who has been kidnapped by the mysterious Mother Miranda. The molded are gone, and this time Ethan faces off against various supernatural horrors, including lichens, vampires, and a weird fetus thing. This time Chris Redfield is back in a major role, but is he an ally or an enemy? Resident Evil Village feels a lot like Resident Evil 4 with its old-fashioned, decrepit European village, but the actual content feels a little similar to Resident Evil 6. The village itself acts as a hub of sorts, and as you travel into other areas of the game world, each area tends to take on different styles. The village feels very much like Resident Evil 4, yet Lady Dimitrescu's castle feels a little bit more like the Resident Evil 2 remake, with the continual pursuit of Lady D harkening back to Mr. X. Chase me harder! House Benevenito feels more like the Resident Evil 7 demo, an area of the game largely bereft of combat, instead focusing on exploration, puzzles and atmosphere. Resident Evil Village had a similar critical response as Resi 7. Once again, major publications such as Destructoid, Electronic Gaming Monthly and GameSpot's all dishing out top-notch reviews, and it would win Game of the Year at the Golden Joystick Awards. Not all were thrilled with this latest Resident Evil game. For instance, Edge Magazine described it as loud and mindless, and a letdown after Resident Evil 7. Personally, I like liked Resi Village. It wasn't as good as Resi 7, but no matter my opinion or anyone else's, Resident Evil Village initially outsold Resident Evil 7. And though it does have some ways to go to totally outsell it, we can probably expect the 9th entry into the series being more akin to Village and the remakes. Speaking of remakes, we would go back to the weird European villages with the Resident Evil 4 remake, and it was good, very good. While Resident Evil 4 arguably didn't need a remake, it offered a new flavour that sits alongside the original perfectly. It's a solid and modern update using the same engine used for Resi 2 and Resi 3 remakes, and it made its way onto several Game of the Year lists. But what next for Resident Evil? Well, Resident Evil 9 is all but confirmed, and it was initially rumoured for a 2025 release. But according to some rumours, it has been delayed internally, so don't expect to see it anytime soon. And that was basically Resident Evil. I hope you enjoyed the list. Great fun going back to experience some of those earlier Resident Evil games, and if you haven't, you should as well. You just have to put up with the jank, what can I say? But why not tell me where you got on the Resident Evil train? Of course, I was there from the start. I'm very old. But I know many people who their first experience was Resident Evil 4, and that's not one to be sniffed at. And if you're new to the train, welcome on board. We're all dead here, chomp on a corpse, enjoy yourself. If you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Thank you very much. I've been Will from Vultures, and I'll see you soon.